Alright everyone, welcome back to another video. Last time we left off with Jefferson and the Revolution of 1800, talking about Thomas Jefferson's presidency and a few other things around that time. Revolution of 1800, not even talking about in America, it's talking about in France. But now we are on to Madison and the War of 1812. James Madison was no warmonger, but he failed to avert the long-threatened intervention of the United States in the European War. Though the Americans had grievances against both sides, those against Britain were the more important of it, for three reasons. The British commanding the seaways were in a position to inflict more damage on commerce with the enemy than could the French. The British conscripted American sailors of British birth, and the British had an apparently vulnerable colony in Canada which some American expansionists hoped to annex. Pressures on President Madison finally brought about the conflict. The British blundered in not removing or suspending their orders in council against trade with France and with the numerous countries under French control. Madison was certainly a man of genius, but his talents lay in law and the Constitution rather than in conducting war. Congress was too penurious in supplying the army and navy, and it might have gone hard with the country if the British had not been forced to turn their main attention to the war with Napoleon. Even as it was, the British kept the United States out of Canada and succeeded in occupying and partly destroying the national capital of Washington. This raid had another significance. Francis Scott Key, anxiously watching the siege of Baltimore from the deck of a ship, was inspired to write the Star-Spangled Banner, which became the national anthem in the 1930s. By sea, the Americans did fairly well, winning several victories in single combat between ships and sweeping Lake Erie free of a small British fleet. The best consolation of all was the land victory by Andrew Jackson at New Orleans. Although it was fought after the peace treaty had been signed at Ghent, there was no Atlantic cable in those days, and neither side knew that the war had ended. The treaty was a compromise, such as might end a drawn war. Nothing was said about the grievances with which the war started, and neither side gained territory or indemnity. But the results were favorable. The nation gained confidence. A peaceful boundary with Canada was eventually established, and never again were Britain and the United States in conflict. Some extreme Federalists were opposed to Mr. Madison's War, as they termed it, um, that they considered secession in New England. But the Hartford Convention did not take this ultimate step, and merely recommended some amendments to the Constitution. This dubious attitude increased the unpopularity of the dying Federalist Party. Yeah, so the War of 1812, technically, America, you could have considered, more or less lost the war. It really didn't go well for the United States. It's just how it is. Um, it was a very unpopular war after it. It didn't really do anything. It was kind of a pointless war too, in the grand scheme of things. Obviously, yes, they do bring up some good points. It does increase a lot of countrymen's um, confidence because a lot of Americans see it as a victory. even nowadays, it is seen as kind of a victory by a lot of Americans because of the Battle of New Orleans with Andrew Jackson, um, who does defeat the British pretty handily. And so it's like, well, this is the final major conflict, or like battle, I should say, not conflict, final major battle, and America won. So a lot of Americans think, oh, we won. Then peace came, obviously, because peace had already been signed and it just had to make its way over. So it's like, oh, Andrew Jackson won, and peace came. Oh, look at that, America won. So that's kind of the idea. And that's kind of probably how it was spun at the time, even. Because it's like, oh, see, we won. Even though the White House gets burned down, the British pretty handily stop us from annexing Canada, and quite a few other things. It's just like, and the British weren't even fully paying attention for most of the war. Near the end of the war, they were. That's kind of actually why Andrew Jackson's victory is so lauded, because the British were paying full attention by the end of the war, because Napoleon has been dealt with. But at the beginning of the war, Britain was fully focused on Napoleon Bonaparte. They did not care about the United States. Lucky for us that they weren't caring so much. Alright, we'll now get into the pictures here. So below is during the War of 1812, York, now Toronto, was attacked by the Americans on the 27th of April, 1813. General Dearborn led the successful raid on the capital of Upper Canada. The American soldiers set fire to the two houses of the provincial parliament, which later gave the British an excuse to burn the government buildings in Washington, D.C. Yeah, so that because they burn those, obviously then it's like, oh, well, we could burn Washington. And they do. The White House gets burned down. Or the greenhouse, I guess, really at that point. The greenhouse gets burned down, and a few other buildings. Luckily, some of the things that were in the White House did not get destroyed. And we still have them because of certain people, when they flee, they grab them. Actually, Mrs. Madison's, President Madison's wife, so Mrs. Madison, she grabs some pretty important things when they're fleeing. At the top here, Captain Oliver Hazard Perry and his men during the Battle of Lake Erie. In order to control the Great Lakes, a small fleet had been built on Lake Erie by the American Navy during the winter of 1812 to 1813. Perry assumed command on the 27th of March, 1813. At Put-in Bay on the 10th of September, 1813, he found the British fleet and won the battle. It was in this conflict that Perry issued his famous settlement, "We have met the enemy, and they are ours." Now, Matthew Perry, but he's very much an important figure here. Matthew Perry. I don't know. I can't believe I said that. Thinking too much of I guess the actor, huh? But Oliver Perry. Um, very, very important guy, especially if you're from this area of like around Put-in-Bay almost. Um, you're from northern Ohio, even eastern Michigan. Um, very important fellow, and a lot of people consider him kind of like a little national, or like a little state hero, even stuff like that. And a lot of people in northern Ohio, they very much consider him that. Taught that too in schools. At the bottom here, a view of the Battle of Currier and Ives. Perry had left the Lawrence far left. Had left in a small boat and had raised his flag on Niagara, the center, pushing through the enemy lines. So I think they mean that ship. And then maybe this one? Hard to say. But yeah, Perry, he really is a decent Navy commander. And obviously we think of like, oh, well, it was on lakes, and that's kind of somewhat, I think, why these battles aren't as talked about. Um, but I mean, you gotta remember the Great Lakes are more or less mini seas of fresh water, um, and Perry's victories are quite stellar, and you really can't underplay how amazing these victories really were. Okay, so here's the overleaf. It's gonna be a little difficult to show both, but I'll try my best. The Battle of New Orleans, the 8th of January, 1815, showing the death of the British commander, Major General Sir Edward Pakenham. The American commander, General Andrew Jackson, faced an invading British army of 10,000 men. Although outnumbered uh, almost 3 to 1, the American troops, consisting mostly of Tennessee militia, won the day. The British suffered 2,000 men killed, the Americans only 13. Yeah, there's the commander that they were talking about, the British one. Yeah, the victory of at New Orleans is kind of crazy. Andrew Jackson, it's one of the reasons he kind of becomes president, is because the popularity that he gets from this battle is quite stellar. The British losing 2,000 to 13 is pretty devastating. Those are some major losses. That's a fifth of your army just gone compared to the Americans who only lost 13. And a lot of the guys are not necessarily soldiers, they're militiamen. They are soldiers in a pinch, but not necessarily the most long-term solution. So above is a representation of the capture of the city of Washington, the 24th of August, 1814. And you can see you got the British all standing there, and there's the White House on fire, even though it's not white, but yeah. At the left here, the remains of the Capitol building after it had been burned by the British. Although the British had no trouble in routing the American militia that were to guard the Capitol, it was another story when they arrived at Baltimore. There, the American forces fought bravely, and the attack on um, F.T. McHenry, Fort McHenry, failed. It was while the British were bombarding the fort that Francis Scott Key wrote the Star-Spangled Banner. Yeah, Fort McHenry holds up a little bit better in Baltimore. Washington, the defense of Washington, or I should say the lack of defense, is kind of crazy to think. You would think they would have tried to be more garrisoned here, more defense in a more of defensive position, but not really. But Baltimore with Fort McHenry, um, it's just a better spot to be fair. And the Americans do not give up on that fort, so it's ultimately a failure. Someone at the top here, the death of Captain James Lawrence on board the frigate Chesapeake during the encounter with the British frigate Shannon, the 1st of June, 1813. Before he died in this battle off Boston Harbor, Lawrence uttered the famous words, "Don't give up the ship." I really like how a lot of these old pictures show, you have the foreground where the main focal point of the painting is happening. Oh, he's dying. But in the background, you can see that just because he's dying doesn't mean everything has stopped. I really love when they show that kind of stuff. It's very interesting. At the bottom here is another view of the Battle of New Orleans. And you can see the American line here what this is. Is a really, really defensible position. And the British, when they come up, it's just they're getting gunned down by these cannons each way. They're out here and they just get gunned down, and it was such an awful attack. Because of how the land was, it was just flat ground all the way to the city, and it was just an awful approach. There was no real way the British could have gotten here at a reasonable pace or time without being gunned down. You have to think it was hubris, or just like, oh well, we have to make the march, no matter what. There had to be another way. There just had to. This is a really awful, awful battle for the British. But that's gonna do it for this video. If you guys liked the video, leave a like. If you have any ways I can improve these videos, leave a comment down below. I just appreciate your feedback. And as always, subscribe. It really does help out the channel. Thank you.